Yeah, as an official statement on Peter Jackson's rendition of The Wheel of Time, I just wanted to say that, too much context was ultimately cut from the film. People describe it as like a bird's eye view of the books and what they're about, but and that is, from what I know so far, kind of an accurate description. But the problem with Peter Jackson's rendition of it was just there just wasn't enough time to do what he wanted to do with the films and what needed to be done to make it actually good. And what I mean ultimately is that despite the fact, like, what The Hobbit is, like, what, 320. I could vomit a book like this in a single night if I was really determined. I mean, I've been doing it a lot lately. I just go through them like they're water. It's not a big deal. It's not even remotely a big deal at all for someone like me who reads at the pace that I do and everything. But this would be like maybe 6 hours of work for me, and if I was really having a good time, I could really easily commit that kind of time to something, not that hard. It might cost me a day, but that's it. That's about all the time it would take me. But the thing about the films, and they're deeply flawed. That's the thing that you know a lot of people, they don't go over, or they don't agree with, or they just don't know. I mean, the problem with the films is that if you hadn't read the books, right, if you didn't know all these details, a lot of the shit that happens in such a way that, like, you just don't understand why it's happening, what the real sense of urgency and threat is, or what the real priority is. You end up asking questions like, why don't they go north towards Mirkwood and everything? What's the problem with it? What are the motivations of these characters? Why are they so concerned about not doing this action in particular? You start to really wonder about those sorts of things watching it and everything, and you start to wonder what the significance of, like, the elves saying that they're planning on departing from the the place that they are, where the whole meeting takes place, where the fellowship basically gets formed in the first meeting of the fellowship. You find yourself wondering, like, what the fucking relevance is that the elves have decided to evacuate the area, because it's not explained. It's that Peter Jackson doesn't even go over it. He doesn't even bother to provide the context, that this area is under threat, that Sauron is, that the elves have protected the whole areas to the south, and everything of where they are and everything, and that now that protection is waning, all the people that are down further south are at greater risk and everything. Like, none of this shit, you know, is even explained in the films, and it's like it's like, going into it as a person who hadn't read the books is kind of like, you know, you're just coming in there, you know. And like, all this shit starts happening, and there's all these things, and you don't have any fucking clue what's really going on. You just don't. You have no, not the not the first fucking clue what any of this shit is, and about, and everything, and why people are acting the way they are, and what their real motivations are, and everything. And in a lot of ways, none of this is even explained. Like, the Return of the King. Like, what you know uh if you just just Peter Jackson cut way too much context for the whole thing to be even understandable to somebody who hadn't read the book. So it's like, it's this bird eyes view of what the plot is about, but unfortunately so much detail is actually missing that I don't see why people found this so fucking enjoyable in the first place. It doesn't really make sense to me. See, I hadn't read The Hobbit. I grew up, reading works that may ultimately pay some homage and respect to the Shire, and that they have that kind of communal background living situation of, like, an ordinary person living in a village sort of thing before they go on, like, the hero's journey and everything. The characters are drawn down and everything, and that's the same shit happened in the Wheel of Time. The beginning of the books goes down a very similar rabbit hole with Rand, Perrin, and Matt and everything. But those were the books that I grew up with. I didn't, and to some extent I also read Mercedes Lackey and growing up and everything, and a lot of these words would pay some homage to Tolkien, but this just I feel like to a lot of respects, I kind of skipped a lot of the steps that many fantasy fans take. They might start off with like the Wheel of Time as like their introduction to fantasy, and with me, my sister was such a prolific literary person and reader that she picked up the books, and I became curious what they were about because of that, and I ended up skipping 1,000 fucking steps that the ordinary fantasy fan would go down in the rabbit hole. And so I was already way in the deep end reading epic fantasy as like my introduction to the genre and everything. And when I use the word epic and in the description of the Wheel of Time, I'm not referring to it in that modern sense of the term, because the modern generation has bastardized the term epic so that it can be applied to just about anything and everything. It's been it's lost a lot of meaning through its overuse in the modern era, and everything. Things that aren't really epic are described as epic all the time. And so, through modern exaggeration and hyperbole, like hyperbole, like this is commonly happening and everything, and like Americans will often exaggerate quite quite extensively, but that's the thing. I grew up on that sort of thing. I grew up on Robert Jordan. I didn't grow up on Tolkien. I grew up on like fantasy fiction that was widely considered some of the much better fantasy by modern audiences and everything. And so I kind of understood to some extent we were living in Tolkien's shadow, but you know, I just wasn't getting the direct experience of Tolkien. It just wasn't. I guess I don't know. I guess I kind of like considered Professor Tolkien to be a little bit too elementary, and so I never really read it. But it's really actually rather weird because a lot of this stuff does have like relevance to my childhood, like this stuff about Durin and everything. Like I grew up playing games that were clearly influenced by Tolkien and everything. So I can see all of this stuff and everything in some of the games that I used to play, but just that is pretty much my take on the films. It's just you want my genuine opinion about them. Well, too much has been cut. The whole problem with it is that it falls apart. When you're adapting a film from a book, if you cut too much of the original context from the books, eventually what you're left with is a giant pile of shit, and that's pretty much what happened with the wheel with respect to the adaptation and Peter Jackson's adaptation of the Lord of the Rings. It's just a big stinky pile of shit.